Welcome to Furthering Christendom. I'm your host, Tyler McNabb, and I'm here with a special guest today, one that we've had on before. Dawn, how are you doing today?
I am excellent. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Uh, what have you been up to since the last we talked?
Still mostly just teaching as I'm at the College of DuPage. So that takes, I gotta say, that takes up most of my time.
Very good. We're talking today about a chapter that you have in this volume from Jonathan Rutledge, Paradox and Contradiction in Theology. Really, really nice book. As someone who's a fan of paradox views, paradox and Christian theology, to quote Anderson's volume on that, I was really excited to read this, really excited to look into it. And your chapter was, I think, the second chapter I read. I was like, you know what, I just want to go ahead and I know she's gonna say some good stuff because I know our past conversations we agree on a lot of things. So I was excited to read it and it was great going through it. So I figured we could just talk about your chapter today. Sound okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. So in your chapter, you say something about um, our language about God, where God is not literally a person, right? Our language about God's analogical. Can you just kind of explain for our listeners, our viewers who maybe aren't so familiar with this, maybe they might think that's like almost blasphemous. Can you go ahead and explain that for us?
Yeah. So when I say that we speak analogically of God, what I mean is that our talk of God appeals either explicitly or implicitly to a similarity. So the thought is that for God to be God, like the creator of everything that exists, it seems like God's going to have to be outside the ontological order that we're familiar with, and that God is not going to be able to be captured by our categories or our concepts. And so rather than being able to just describe God directly by ascribing normal predicates to God, the analogical theory says we have to describe God kind of indirectly by describing something else and saying God is sort of like that. That's sort of, God is something similar to that. But we don't think that we can get the exact truth because it's sort of beyond our comprehension. And so, I mean, you might worry that, yeah, that seems like, oh, so you're saying God's not literally a person, that God doesn't literally love me, etc. But I think that would be a misleading way of characterizing my view. So, what some people who've written on analogy have distinguished between analogies we think we can see behind versus analogies we can't see behind. And I think that makes a big difference. So there's one way of interpreting something as analogical, which is really just a way of denying it, right? Like if somebody says, so, imagine a pantheist who just identifies God with the universe, and they say, oh, I think God is a person, metaphorically, in the sense that the universe is incommensurably valuable, just like people are, or something. Like that person, when they say, oh, sure, I think God is a person metaphorically, what they really think is that God is not a person. The analogical interpretation there is just a way of denying the doctrine. That's not the kind of analogical interpretation I'm trying to defend. The kind of analogical interpretation I'm trying to defend says, this is literally as close to the truth about God as we can get. So if you were to conceive of God as non-personal, that would be further from the truth.
Mhm. Right.
And so it wouldn't really be fair to then describe me as saying God's not literally a person. It's just like, look, God escapes our conceptual categories, and that's just a general problem.
Yeah. So it's um, we can say more true to talk about God as a person, right? Is he a person in the exact same way that you and I are persons? No, God transcends the category of personal, but nonetheless, that's it's the most apt thing we can say, right?
Yeah,
That's the
yeah,
view. Great.
yeah.
So here's one objection, as I'm sure you're familiar with. I think you even did your PhD dissertation on this kind of related topic. So I'm sure you've come across it before, right? And it's an objection typically aimed, at least in the sort of tradition that I'm familiar with, in the scholastic tradition of St. Thomas Aquinas, against his view, which is that ultimately analogy is going to need to bottom out in something in some sort of univocal predication, right? That you can't really have analogical predication without there being something univocal there. How would you respond to that? What would you say to that?
Yeah. So,
And let me clarify. How does Dawn, like, you don't need to like reference Thomas or like how Thomas would, but just how do you
yeah.
respond to that?
I'm going to be honest. I'm not sure I can defend the Thomas picture, although my own account is very strongly influenced by
Yeah.
Aquinas, but it's also pretty distinct. And one way that it's distinct is I actually don't define analogy in terms of univocity versus
Mm.
equivocity. So Aquinas defines analogy as a midpoint between univocity and equivocity. I, with all respect to Aquinas, I don't think that's the best way to do it. So
Okay.
my way of defining analogy is as something where you're appealing to a similarity
Hmm.
that can be related to this univocity equivocity thing, but it's really pretty distinct. So for example, if I make a claim like God is some God is similar to a person,
Mm.
actually every word in that sentence has its normal sense.
Mm.
The word person in that sense, has its normal sense, and I'm saying God is similar to that. So one way you can speak analogically would be to take a word and then give it a special sense and say, well, I'm going to call God a person, but it has this special analogical sense. But you wouldn't have to do it that way. You could just say God is similar to, and that would be a way of expressing an analogical claim. So yeah, so I think it's probably true that you need to have univocal ways of speaking to get analogical ways of speaking, but I'm not sure that that affects my view. But the
Mm.
question is like, does this actually address the objection, or have I just obnoxiously sidestepped it without really addressing the objection? I'm not sure.
No, so I take it that what you're saying is something like, um, so instead of saying that analogical language is that which is between univocal and equivocal predication, instead you think that we can just kind of gloss analogical predication in the sense of saying just something is similar to. And I guess your idea is that maybe if you just say something is similar to X, uh, then that's not going to require univocal predication. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, it is univocal predicate. Like all of the words are being used univocal with
Right,
their
right,
previous.
right. But
Um,
I guess the idea is that um, okay. Sorry, I get what you're saying. It's a univocal predication. Everything's being used in the right way, but there's still kind of analogicalness going on, so to speak,
yeah,
because you're saying similar to. So
yeah.
there's
So like I'm saying God isn't a person in
right,
the sense of the word that I'm a person.
right,
If you wanted to say God was a person, it would have
right,
to be in an analogical sense. But
right.
I mean, I can say everything I want to say using my words in their normal senses.
Got it.
It's just one of those words is similar to.
Right. That's right. That's right. Okay. So what about like you talk about irreducibly analogical? What's that about?
Yeah. So normally when we speak analogically, it's possible for us to then cash out what we mean non-analogically. So I think in this paper or some paper, I use the example of this, but I might tell you a sudachi is similar to a line. Um, and if you'd never heard of a sudachi, that would be a useful piece of information. But if I wanted to render, so that's an analogical claim because it's describing a sudachi in terms of something it's similar to. But if I wanted to then be a little clearer, I could then say, well, what I mean by that is it's a citrus fruit, it's sour, it's small and round and greenish. And that's what I meant by saying it was similar to a lime. And so if I can do that, I can basically take this analogical claim and reduce it to a set of non-analogical claims. So when I say that something's irreducibly analogical, I'm saying you can't do that. So if claims about God are analogical, and that's meant to be like to be coming from like a deep problem with how we speak about God, clearly they'll have to be irreducibly analogical. That I can say God is similar to a person, but I'm not going to be able to just say, well, he's similar to a person in this, because he has this property and this property and this property and this property. Or if I can list properties, those are also themselves going to be analogical. So you
So
can't avoid the reliance on the analogy.
so for those who say um, uh, this kind of irreducibly analogical language view will ultimately make um, sentences contentless, right,
Mhm.
or claims contentless. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, William Alston makes this objection. I think a few people make this objection. Yeah, I think this is a very natural worry, and is maybe one of the biggest objections to the analogical theory. Is like, look, if I tell you, skip the Sudachi example. So I tell you a tabugish is similar to a lime. I just made that word up. And then you ask me, oh, so is it a citrus fruit? And I say no. And you ask me, oh, so is it round? No. Is it green? No. Is it made of atoms at least? No. And like every specific respective similarity you think of, I'm like, no, no, that doesn't apply. At some point, you're going to feel like, well, by telling me that this is similar to a lime, you haven't told me anything at all. Like if you tell me some X is similar to Y, but you can't specify any specific respect in which the similarity holds, it seems like that claim is just empty of content. Yeah, so my solution to that problem, because I do think it's a big problem, my solution to that problem has a few different components, and you kind of need them all. But to be like brief about it, like one thing you definitely want to say is you need to make the similarity claim a bit more restrictive, a bit more strict. So it won't work to just say God is in some way similar to a person. That really is empty of content. Everything is in some way similar to a person. The lamp on my desk is similar to a person in some ways. So you're gonna have to make it much stricter. So specifically, what I propose is that if you want to have an analogical theology, you should say that certain claims are irreplaceably good analogies for God, where the idea is um, we take certain like analogical models of God to be like divinely revealed, where God told us, like, if you want to think about me, this is the best way you can think about me. And so what you would then believe on faith is like, if I think of God in terms of these models, that is as close to the truth as I can get. It's not just that God is in some way similar to this, but this is literally the best way of representing God, given the human perspective and human limitations. Um, so that's one thing. Um, to
And that
make
goes
this a
back
little
to
more
what we talked
contemptible.
about at the very beginning, right? Where when we're talking about God as a person, it's the most apt statement, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's the statement that carries the most truth, that sort of gets our mind to the closest position possible,
Yeah,
uh,
exactly.
but nonetheless, not exact, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I mean, really, it might be that what I should say is that there might be like a set of models that's irreplaceable. It might not just be one model. There might have to be a few complementary ones, but something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, yeah. But then also, I think, there's still also a practical problem of like, what are you supposed to do with these similarity claims? And so what I want to argue is, we don't just have these like isolated atomic similarity claims of like God is similar to merciful, God is
Mhm.
similar to this. Like instead, what you have is a model, like where a model is like a network of complex interrelated similarity claims that's meant to have some kind of like proportional analogy to God, to the thing it's modeling. And the thing about a model is when you have a model, you can use it in surrogative thought, where you can think about God in terms of the model. And so the model gives you a way to think about God, and it tells you how to relate to God. And so when you have an analogical model of God, somebody who accepts something as an analogical model of God, their religious faith and practice is actually going to look exactly the same as somebody
Right.
who took that to just be the straightforward non-analogical truth about God. Because that's just how models work, is that you can use them to think with, and you use it to think with in place of the thing that it's representing.
That's good. What about kind of objections to theism, right? Assuming this analogical predication view that you're espousing. Um, so let's say like the problem of evil, even, right? God exists. Why evil? He's all good. Would want to stop evil. All powerful, be able to do it, and all knowing. He'd know where all the evil's at, right? But we have evil, right? Do you think uh, that your model's kind of helpful for dissolving issues like this? So, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with Father Brian Davis's book on God and evil, where he says, "Well, God's not a person, at least in the same way you and I are persons. he, is existence itself. He's the grounding of all being. Evil is just the privation of good. So you should stop thinking like the problem of evil in some sort of really anthropomorphic way where it makes God to be like you and I. And it's like, well, you and I would stop this, so clearly God would, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that you have your model sort of has resources to do something similar, right? Where maybe these kinds of objections or the problem of divine hiddenness, etc., are assuming univocal predication, or assuming that we're understanding God in just the right literal 100% sense, and the more you sort of say that, well, you got our statements are the most apt, but nonetheless, since there's room for exactness, so to speak, things might not follow from whether or not we were doing univocal predication. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think there are probably other ways. You might not need to appeal to analogy to respond to the problem of evil or the problem of divine hiddenness. Although, but some people might
Yeah.
think that you. So yeah, it's different people find different problems to be the real sticking point. But yeah, for any problem where you're in a situation where you're like, I seem to be committed to this claim about God that God is X. I seem to be committed to this claim about God that God is Y, and there's a contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, accepting an analogical theory can maybe not resolve the problem, but can make it okay that the
Yeah.
problem is there. Because if God's not X in the sense I understand, or God isn't Y in the sense I understand, if it's really just that God is something similar to X and God is something
Mm-hmm.
similar to Y, then it's no longer surprising that they contradict, and that no longer proves me wrong in
Right.
saying that God is similar to
Right.
both of these things. Yeah, I think Richard Swinburne uses this example of like wave particle duality, where
Mm-hmm.
like light is in some ways really like a classical Newtonian wave in a medium, and light is in other ways really like a particle, like a classical Newtonian particle. So those two models like something can't be literally straightforwardly both a wave and a particle. We have now this like quantum model of light that unites these two things. So we have a higher understanding of light now. So we're able to really understand how it can be, not me, but someone is able to really understand how it can be both like a wave and like a particle. But like if somehow the quantum model of light were cognitively inaccessible to us, which I think is, what would be true about God, is that the truth about God that unites these two things is cognitively accessible to us. We might just be left with these two models that conflict at some points, or these two claims that
Mm-hmm.
conflict at some points.
Oh. What about like natural theology? Do you think analogical predication prevents us from inferring God's existence? Uh, Go ahead.
Yes. The answer is yes. So yeah, like yeah, so an irreducibly analogical claim is a very epistemically odd thing, right? Normally, if you have a claim that something is, the only way you could get to a claim that something is similar to something else is by knowing some specific respects in which they're similar. Like you notice that like both this and this have this property, so then I infer that they're similar in virtue of that shared property. So it's really weird to be in a position where you know that X is similar to Y, but you can't specify any specific respect in which the similarity holds. That's a bizarre epistemic position. And as far as I can see, the only possible way you could truly be in a position to be justified in believing a claim of that form would be by authority. So if an authority, a trusted authority, tells you X is similar to Y, and then walks away before telling you in what way, you're now in a position where you're justified in believing that they're similar, but without knowing why. But that's really the only way. And so I think if you have this irreducibly analogical theology, you are not going to be able to justify it purely on the basis of natural theology. You're going to have to appeal to special revelation.
What do you think about so some of Aquinas's later interpreters will argue that obviously analogy can be degreed, right? And so the closer you are to being, the statement being more apt than not, then it might be the case that we can go ahead and say that our syllogisms are mapping on to the right conclusion, right? All of a
Yeah.
sudden, validity can be there. What separate obviously not always with analogical predication. Some analogical predication, right? It's not degreed enough. It's not close enough. But other analogical statements within premises and so forth, sufficiently high enough degree, it's sufficiently high enough apt, the conclusion can follow, right? So, like, what do you make of this kind of reasoning?
No,
Not a
so yeah,
fan.
I'm afraid that's really where I depart from the Thomistic tradition. Or like, and I'm not even sure. I mean, like whether that later, like very sort of optimistic
Yeah,
Thomistic tradition, whether that's even true to Aquinas, I'm really not so sure.
yeah, okay.
Aquinas himself often sounds much more apophatic than many of his later interpreters.
Oh, that's true.
Um, but yeah, I don't think that works because the only reason we appealed to analogy in the first place was because we kept coming into conflicts where it's like, well, how could God be this and this? Those contradict. And so then we had to appeal to analogy. So if that's the reason you're appealing to analogy, well, any evidence I have for thinking this claim is true is evidence against this other claim. And any evidence I have for thinking this claim is true is evidence against this other claim. So unless you have a trust, so yeah, your evidences are defeating each other.
Okay.
So
And so, what do you think about his natural theology in general? Do you think that's being consistent with his view, or do you think that it's kind of in tension or at odds?
I I don't know what to think about Aquinas. I have such a
Yeah.
hard time. Like Aquinas was the fundamental inspiration of my entire
Nice.
intellectual project,
Yeah.
but I have no idea what's going on there. Like sometimes he sounds like he thinks, ah, it's basically univocal. I mean, it's not technically, but it might as well be. And then sometimes he sounds like he's this like radically negative theologian. I don't know how to put it together. I
Yeah.
don't know how to interpret him. I am not willing to spend the decades it would take committing
Sure. Sure.
myself to uh, Aquinas
Well,
exegesis to have an opinion. I just don't know.
well, what about uh what are you going to spend the next I don't know couple years on? What's your next project you're working on?
um, I mean, what I'm working on right now is basically like the book version of the article that you just read. Um,
Nice.
so like to properly flesh it out. But I am also just sort of generally interested in like a sort of philosophical rehabilitation of similarity. I
Okay.
feel like similarity has gotten a bad rap as something that's sort of like specious, that
Right.
appeals to similarity or kind of suspect. And I think that there's more value there than people sometimes think.
Awesome. Well, we look forward to that coming out. So thanks so much, John, for joining me today. And obviously, you're welcome anytime because well, we might have a little bit of disagreement in reference to like maybe Aquinas, and I kind of do like that kind of preferred response about um, validity still happening because analogy can be more apt than not. Uh, Nonetheless, there are few of us in analytic philosophy of religion who are as keen on analogy, I think, and analogical irreducibility and so forth. So, very excited to have you on, and really looking forward to reading your book.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Take care.